What's up, everyone? Happy Friday. As you know, Pittsburgh Miller's Poetry Party is fast underway. It is scheduled for next week, Wednesday, February 24th at 5:30 p.m. Message me if you are outside of the Miller family and interested in logging in, and I will share the link with you. I've been sharing different story time texts with our school community as our poetry party approaches. Yesterday, I shared some pieces by Langston Hughes, and today I want to share a piece. This is a text. It's a little longer, so parents, you know, this may be one where you have the children sit and listen in because it is important, and then maybe talk about it afterwards. The title of this story is The Remarkable Story of George Moses Horton, poet. And normally, when Dr. Stark speaks to you about the African and African American journey, it's about our liberation. I think that as a child and as a student in the Pittsburgh Public Schools, I oftentimes learned too much about the enslavement of African American people and not enough about our liberation. And I think that we are still guilty of that in schools today. So I try to make it a point to talk to you about liberated Africans and African Americans. However, this text is a little different. It does talk about a man who was enslaved and his journey to seek liberation. And it's important that we know and realize the depth of the journey of our enslaved ancestors and elders, and the resilience and the grit and the fortitude that they possessed to endure some of the things that they went through, and to fight the fights that they fought. And it helps you better understand some of the plights of Black and brown people still today. So I thought this was a very good read. It may feel a little lengthy, so if you don't have the time, come back to this when you do, because it's important to give it the time that it deserves. Let's listen in. The Remarkable Story of George Moses Horton, poet. And this is his journey on becoming a poet. And I thought it was so relevant because we're approaching our poetry party. I'll try to turn the text so that you can still see the illustrations. You see my children behind me. The best parts of Dr. Starks. I can't leave Rocco out. Okay, we're trying to record a story here. You're going to have to be quiet, Rock. I know you're excited, but you need to be respectful. Can I go on? Rocco, can I continue? Thank you. Okay, let's listen in. George loved words. He wanted to learn how to read, but George was enslaved. He and his family lived on a farm in Chatham County, North Carolina, where they were forced to work long hours. There wasn't much time for anything else. Besides, George knew his master would not approve of his slaves reading. But that didn't stop George from admiring the language that was all around him. Inspirational words read from the Bible, hopeful words delivered in a sermon, lively words sung in songs. George was determined to learn how to read. When white children studied their books, he lingered nearby. He listened as they repeated the letters of the alphabet. Soon, George could recite the alphabet himself. His mother would have liked to help him, but she couldn't. Instead, she gave George one of her most valuable possessions, a Wesley hymnal, a book of songs. It was George's very first book. He scanned the pages, trying to make out the letters. It was no use. He could not read the words. Then George found an old spelling book. It was tattered and some pages were missing, but it was enough to get him started. George thumbed through its pages. He recognized some of the letters. At night, when he should have been resting after a long day of work, George studied by firelight. His eyes burned from the smoke. Soon he could make out a few words. Before long, he could understand entire sentences. Over time, George taught himself to read. And again, this is a true story. From that point forward, George not only loved words, he could read and understand them too. George read verses from the New Testament. He read books, newspaper articles, advertisements, whatever he could find. Most of all, George read poems. He loved beautiful poetry. Rise up, my soul, and let us go up to the gospel feast. From early morning until late at night, George tended cattle on his master's farm. While he worked, George composed his own poetry, mingling his words with the tunes of familiar songs. He hadn't learned how to write his poems down yet, so he committed them to memory. Did you hear that? He committed them to memory. Words and rhymes were stored inside his head. His verses swayed with emotion like the music of Sunday services. They kept him strong as he grew to be a young man. When George was 17, his master decided to split up his estate. He divided his possessions, land, cattle, wagons, tools, among his family. Slaves were considered to be property too. That means that black and brown people who were enslaved were not considered to be fully human. They were considered to be the property of their owners. So George's family was separated. George was given to his master's son. He feared he would never see his mother, brothers, and sisters again. So this is part of the demise of the black family and how we had to continue to live after being separated from our parents and our children. George toiled in the fields on his new master's property. It was disagreeable work, but he found a little relief on Sundays. On that day, George walked 8 miles to the village of Chapel Hill, to the campus of the University of North Carolina. There, he sold fruit and vegetables grown on his master's farm. He didn't mind the long walk, though. George welcomed the opportunity to get away. At first, the college students teased George. To distract himself from their insults, George recited his poetry. Words, sweet as the fruit piled high in his cart, sprung from his lips. Every eye grew wide and every mouth fell open at the sound of George's voice, uttering beautiful verses. The students were awestruck when they found out that he had composed them himself. News of the slave poet raced through campus like a brisk flowing river. Students swarmed in close to hear George perform his verses. Some of them decided to help George. They gave him their books, English grammar and dictionaries, history and oratory, classic literature and poetry. George soaked up these new subjects like a sponge. One day, a student requested a poem for his sweetheart. George created a verse for the woman. He dictated the poem to the student, who wrote it out neatly. The young lady swooned when she read it. After that, other students wanted George's poems, and they were willing to pay for them too. George composed more than a dozen love poems a week, selling them for 25 cents each. Some paid him with fine suits and shoes instead of money. In time, George dressed as sharply as the students themselves. With money, nice clothes, and newfound status, George felt freer than he had ever felt in all of his life. But he was not free. He remained the property of his master. George continued to work on the farm during the week and visit Chapel Hill on the weekends. The story of the slave poet reached the wife of a professor. Carolyn Lee Hentz was a professional writer and published poet. George's poems affected her deeply. Some made her smile while others made her cry. She sought out George and taught him how to write his poems on paper with a pen. After so many years of memorizing verses, George could now write them down. I wish you all could see this doll. Caroline arranged for George's poems to be printed in the Gazette, the newspaper of her hometown, Lancaster, Massachusetts. Now George was a published poet. His poems protested his enslavement. No other American slave had done that before. Here he is making history. Soon George's work appeared in other newspapers, including Freedom's Journal, the first African-American owned newspaper in the country. George's heart could barely contain his growing pride. Rocco, do you want to listen to the story? With money from his writing and odd jobs, George was able to pay his master for his time so that he could live in Chapel Hill and work as a poet. It was an illegal arrangement, but his master didn't care. George was now a full-time writer, but he still was not a free man. In time, George published The Hope of Liberty, his first book. He wanted to use his earnings to purchase his freedom. When editors at Freedom's Journal learned of his plan, they tried to raise money to help him. Influential people joined the cause. Newspapermen, a college president, a governor. They offered a great deal of money, but George's master refused to sell his valuable slave. George was devastated. Meanwhile, abolitionists in the North worked to end slavery. They published books. They printed posters and pamphlets. They blanketed the South with their calls for enslaved people to rise up against their masters. Slaves who could read told others their message. As a result, more slaves did fight back, and some even killed their masters. Fear ruled the South. New laws were passed in North Carolina. People who printed and distributed anti-slavery materials were penalized. Worse yet, it became illegal to teach a slave how to read and write. Worse yet, it became illegal to teach a slave how to read and write. And we talk about achievement disparities. When there was a time in the history of this country when it was illegal to teach someone who had the same skin color as me how to read and write. We know that the playing field is not level. So we have to work that much harder because literacy is our liberation. That's a whole nother conversation. Let me continue. Now it was too dangerous for George to write poems that protested slavery. He couldn't do it anymore. But he didn't stop writing altogether. He published his second book, The Poetical Works of George M. Horton, which contained poems about life, love, death, and friendship. In 1861, war broke out between the North and South, mainly over the issue of slavery. Do we know what that war was called? Most of the students went off to fight to defend the South. With few people left on campus to purchase his poems, George had no way to earn money to pay for his time away from his master. He had to return to the farm. Am I sadly cast aside on misfortune's rugged tide? Will the world my pains deride forever? That's one of his pieces. The Civil War, there's your answer, raged on for 4 long years. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln set the nation on a new course by signing the Emancipation Proclamation. That soon led to the end of slavery. At the age of 63, George was finally free. Now that he was a free man, George no longer had to remain on the farm. Later that spring, he packed his pens and paper and left. George went west to the Union Army, camping along the way. He wrote poems about his travels, about his family and friends back home, and about all the things he had experienced in his long life. George's love of words had taken him on a great journey. Words made him strong. Words allowed him to dream. Words loosened the chains of bondage long before his last day as a slave. I'd love thee as long as I live, whatever thy condition may be. All else but my life would I give, that thou was as partial to me. The end. This is just an author's note in the back. And I thought it was important to read this piece today because I just want us to really reflect on the journey that we've had as people of color and the hurdles and the obstacles that we've had to overcome in order to flourish in this society, and the importance, the necessity of maximizing opportunities to learn and to grow, to fill our brain with as much information as possible, because that is what gives us additional options out here in the world, choices that we can make for our lives and for the lives of our family and our children and our children's children. So, boys and girls, I know that virtual learning may be tiresome. I know that there are days that you are over it. But I challenge you, continue to pick up a book. Continue to read. Continue to expand your mind. Because this information that lives inside your brain, no one can take that from you. And you can use that information and that knowledge and that creativity and that innovation to make a difference in this world and to leave it better than you found it. Our ancestors, our elders, they're counting on us to be the change that we want to see in the world. So I hope this piece helps someone today. And we encourage you to join us at next week's poetry party. Keep reading. Peace.